Morning everyone. This video lesson is an introduction to power and conflict poetry for the AQA GCSE English Literature syllabus. So in this session we're going to have a look at the basics of what to expect in this qualification. So what we mean by the anthology, what we mean by power and conflict. It's just a very simple introduction to the overall course here. At various points, I'm going to ask you to pause the video and complete a few tasks. For that, just need a pen and paper or access to a Word document. So, like I said, the key words in this anthology are power and conflict. Every single poem in the anthology links to these two themes. So we're going to start by just looking at these two words in isolation. So I'd like you to write down what you think power and conflict mean. I'd like you to list 5 different types of power, so for example physical strength, and also list 5 different types of conflict. So for example, an argument is a type of conflict. To help you out, I've got 4 images here which link to power and conflict in various ways. So have a look at the images if you're struggling a bit. Pause the video now, have a go at that. Okay, so hopefully you've had a go at listing these types of power, but we'll start with the definitions. So power and conflict are not quite as simple as you think. Again, they're very ordinary words that we'd all use, day to day. Maybe not conflict, hopefully, but again, they don't seem that intimidating. But if you start scratching away at the surface, there's a few interpretations here. But for me, I think power has to involve the ability to control or have influence over something or someone else. So if I'm picking up a pen, for example, I've got power over it. I'm in control of it physically. If I try to do the same thing to my car, if I get it a millimetre off the ground, I certainly won't be in control of it. I'm not in charge of its movements, ergo I don't have power over it. But as well as physically, that could also be, with influence. If I've got power over someone, that other person should do what I say at all times. If they're not, I haven't got power over them. I've not influenced them to have that power. So for me, it's about this idea of being able to control or have that influence over something or someone else. And with conflict has to have 2 sides to it. It has to be some kind of struggle between 2 sides, whether it's 2 teams playing a sport, whether it's 2 people having an argument, 2 people running around, whatever it might be, or even actually doesn't have to be 2 separate people or 2 separate bodies. It could be 2 sides within your own head. So if we look at Homer there in the bottom left-hand corner, he's having that classic moral conflict. On the one side, the angel saying, don't eat any more donuts, and the other side, the devil saying, go on, have 3 more, the family won't know, they don't eat any anyway. So he's having an internal conflict. There's 2 sides, they're just not 2 separate people, they're 2 sides of his own brain, if you will. And that comes up quite a bit in this anthology. So I'll show you the list of what I've got. This is by no means exhaustive, but what I've picked out are the sort of ideas that come up in the poems. So it might be worth writing these down. So obviously physical power we've talked about. Social or political power. So again, politicians have power to influence people, either by passing laws or by, again, convincing people to vote for them. But also socially, if you see a group of children, there'll often be 1 or 2 kind of ringleaders in there who have the ability to control other people, and sadly adults as well, even though we think we've grown out of it. Individuals can be powerful or powerless, as the case may be. If you look at the picture on the top right there, there is a person who's individually quite powerful compared to all the people who are holding their hands up. There's religious and cultural power. So again, religion can make people do certain things, whether it's just going to church on a Sunday or whatever. Again, if you look at the picture in the top left, you've got a person worshipping an icon linking to the power of an object. But also that object is of a car. So even though it's lampooning it a bit and it's someone doing a religious pose to something quite silly here, it's a symbol of the power of an object and this power of wealth, almost like this person is worshipping the idea of having a shiny new car. And also, I couldn't find a picture for it, but the power of nature, it comes up quite a bit. Whether the natural world has a lot of power over us, whether we like it or not, comes up quite a lot in the poetry anthology. In terms of conflict, you can have a physical conflict, a fight, an argument, or a verbal conflict, which we've talked about. A moral conflict, again, like Homer's one there, that's internal conflict. What's morally right, what's morally wrong? Is there an internal conflict here? And also war is a fairly major form of conflict, one we're going to see a lot of in the anthology. Lots of poems there specifically about war. There's also a cultural conflict, so whether that's just two different cultures sort of coming into conflict with each other, whether it's two different nations or just two different ways of approaching the world, two different cultures, they can conflict. Humans and nature can have conflicts. I mean, every single time you weed the garden, you're having a conflict with nature. Nature wants to grow the weeds. You want those weeds to go away. Same deal. Every time you put on a coat, you're having a conflict with nature. Keep the cold out. Rulers and the population, again, going back to politicians here. And also maybe an emotional conflict. And again, in the poetry anthology, they tend to be kicked off by memories of certain things. Maybe traumatizing memories can create an emotional conflict in you. So if you need to pause the video to get those down, feel free. So the anthology looks a bit like this. Here's the poems in the conflict cluster. There's two clusters. One is love and relationships. The other one's power and conflict. If your teachers are taking you through power and conflict, don't worry about love and relationships, leave it alone. There'll be two questions in the exam. You choose one of them. So you either choose the love and relationships or you choose the power and conflict poetry question. So don't worry about the other poems, just worry about the ones in the cluster. These are the ones that I teach. These are the ones I'm making the video of. Okay, so there's the index here. And this will be on the exam paper as well, which we're going to look at now. Here's what an exam paper looks like. Front page is on the left. On the right is what a question looks like. So like I've said, they'll give you a copy of the poem they refer to in the question and a list of all the other poems. So you'll notice the question is compare the ways poets present ideas about power in Ozymandias and in one other poem from Power and Conflict. They've given you Ozymandias. They want you to talk about the presentation of power, the importance of power and conflict here. So just power in this poem, which they've given you, so you can quote from there, you can annotate it, do what you like, and one of the other poems. So you'll need to know, ideally, all of those poems well enough to be able to quote from them. Probably more likely on a practical basis, you'll probably know about half of them really, really well, and half of them you'll know kind of okay. But you'll probably find poems you prefer writing about, and those will be the ones you'll focus on more. You only have to pick one other, and they all kind of link together anyway. But either way, that's what it looks like. So what we've got here then is I'm going to show you a series of short, simple descriptions of the poems from the Power and Conflict cluster. You need to copy down the description and underneath it or next to it, write a sentence explaining how it links to power and conflict. So I'll give you an example here. Get this one down. The situation in one of the poems, called Exposure, is a group of soldiers in the World War I trenches are being slowly killed by the extreme weather. So I'd write that down and I'd think, where's the power in this poem? The power is probably in the weather, in nature, sort of dominating these people. And the conflict is probably the conflict between the soldiers and the weather, which is quite ironic because you normally think of war as being a conflict between two nations or two armies. But here, the conflict is between people and weather. So that's what I've done. I've just put power. The weather's more powerful than the soldiers. And conflict, the soldiers are fighting against the weather. So I need to pause that and copy that down. On the next slide, I'm just going to show you three other descriptions, which you're going to write down and do exactly the same thing. Have a think. How can you link it to power or conflict? So here we have three descriptions of situations from the anthology poems. I'll let you read those. And I'd like you to write a sentence or two for each one, explaining the link to power or conflict. If you need a hand, have a look back at the example on the last slide. So pause the video, have a go at that. Right, you should have had enough time to have a go at that now. Let's see what I've come up with. So, the huge statue of a tyrannical ruler has been built by slaves, and now it's crumbling and in ruins. So with power here, it's about the power of the bloke who built the statue. which is, well, the guy who ordered the statue to be built. People don't build their own statues these days, but people can have a lot of power over others. For example, someone ordered that statue to be built by the slaves, so he has power over those slaves. But also, the fact that statue's in ruins could be symbolic for their power, so maybe that power might crumble if they're a bit cruel to people. Again, they are a tyrannical ruler, which means a mean ruler here. And there's definitely a conflict between the rulers and the ordinary people, kind of symbolized by that statue. So that's Ozymandias. Look for the videos on that. Second one, a former frontline soldier is now at home, having been at war, but keeps having flashbacks about killing someone. So the power here is about the power of memory, because he's seen an action, a particular act, and that has imprinted a memory into his head and given what we call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder here. So that's really about how these tough memories can weaken quite a physically strong person, and also in terms of conflict, how war can affect people mentally as well as physically, which we didn't really pay enough attention to, in my opinion, until relatively recently. Luckily, there's a lot more about it now, and this poem is certainly about that. That poem is called Remains, and that's about the mental suffering of soldiers who've experienced trauma. Thirdly, we've got a war photographer developing photographs from the war, and they're causing him some mental distress. So here, the power is about, again, the power of memory, but also the power of an object, just to photograph a picture. This is back in the days of, physical pictures. You take it down to snappy snaps to get developed, and they're physically unremarkable. They're thin on paper, but that picture is creating a really distressing memory and has a lot of power over him. But again, how war itself can affect people mentally as well as physically in the case of the photographer. So what we're going to do now then is look at a particular quotation. And this quotation is from the poem Exposure, which reads, "Our brains ache in the merciless iced east winds that knive us." And I would like you to copy down the quotation and annotate, so underline and give a little comment on, a word or phrase that shows power or conflict. If you can't remember the power or conflict in the poem, it's on the left in the green box. So there's several words I would underline. I'm going to show you that shortly, but just for the time being, have a go at that. Pause the video and just pick out one word or phrase that shows power or conflict between nature and the humans. Okay, so here's what I found. I've color coded it for you to make it nice and easy. So I've got the idea of brains aching. That ache is kind of a constant dull pain. So it's like their brains are being worn down by the weather. We've got the word merciless, which means without mercy. So this weather just keeps attacking them even when they're suffering. We've got the words iced, so like painfully cold, icy cold. And we've also got those S sounds, iced east winds, which again, for me, represent the biting wind. That repetition of the S is referred to as sibilance. It's a technique you'll see in quite a few of these poems here. So that shows, kind of represents that how cold that wind is. You can almost hear it as the poem's going on. And you've got the word knife, so like the weather is physically attacking them and trying to kill them, like it's trying to stab them. Okay, and again, a knife is a murderous weapon. It's quite sneaky. It's not plainly obvious like a sword or anything. It's something you go up behind someone and stab them. It's sneaky, it's nasty. It shows how dangerous this weather is and how it can just affect you almost without you noticing it. Right, so the takeaway from this then, there's 15 poems you need to know, and there'll be plenty of videos coming up which take you through all of those poems, the ideas, the actual analysis itself, and also how to respond to them. Make sure when you're reading and analysing those poems, make sure you do it through the lens of power and conflict. Every single poem links to power and conflict. That's why they've put them in this cluster. The question will always be about power or conflict. So you should have in your head, when you finish all this work and revision, all 15 poems and broadly what they say about power and conflict and how they say it. And if you can bring that up, you can answer any question. And finally, make sure you focus on those key elements and explain what the writer is trying to say about power or conflict. So if you go back to what we just said about the iced east winds kniving us, going from word level, that word knife, right up to this idea of how that links to conflict between humans and nature, that is where all the marks are. So if you can go from word level and link that up to power and conflict, you're getting all the marks you need. Hope that's useful.